In the 1920s, when people started talking about cigarettes as coffin nails and referring to smoker's cough, the public became worried that tobacco was dangerous for them.
Despite years of research, scientists continue to disagree about the alleged hazards of cigarette smoking. Whatever conclusions have been drawn thus far are largely the result of statistics, not clinical or scientific proof. Obviously, much more research is needed. The tobacco industry has granted millions for independent scientific study and will continue its support so that we may replace controversy with facts.
These were the master marketers. The cigarette people really invented many of our modern techniques of advertising.
And I've looked at an enormous library of advertisements. I'm always very tempered in my admiration for the genius. There is, in fact, exceptional genius at play.
I mean, it's like the Borg in the old Star Trek, you know, they're constantly adapting. It's very, very hard to regulate the tobacco companies because they have so much money and they're good at what they do.
The very first cigarettes are actually smoked by the Mayans going back about 1,000 years. So those go way back because cigarette really just means little cigar. Another definition of a cigarette is tobacco rolled in paper. And so actually the first European cigarettes, as opposed to the Mayan ones, were in the 17th century. And those were smoked in Spain. And those were actually just little bits of trashy cigars that had been thrown away. And the poor people would roll those up in newspapers. And so the very first cigarettes were actually just rolled trash.
The modern tobacco industry is really the confluence of four technological developments in the late 19th, early 20th century. The first was the cigarette manufacturing machine, the Bonsack machine.
The invention of the Bonsack machine in 1881 is probably the most important technical invention in the history of cigarettes because whereas before that time, the cigarette girls who used to roll all the cigarettes, they could only roll about 200 to 1,000 per day. But one of these machines could roll 100,000 in a day. It dramatically lowered the cost of cigarettes. So cigarettes prior to that time had really been a luxury. They'd been smoked by dandies or rich people. They were kind of an effete luxury product. But after that, they became much more of a mass market product.
The second was the invention of safety matches. Because before we had safety matches, it was very hard to light tobacco products without burning yourself. If you used the old phosphorus matches, they could have exploded. A lot of people were injured. So the development of a safe, portable way to light the cigarettes was important. The third thing was the development of mass communications.
The longtime head of the CBS network, William Paley, was on record as saying television was the greatest cigarette vending machine ever invented. And what Paley was saying was this business of television is really about selling products.
And the fourth, which went with that, was the development of modern advertising. And it was really the tobacco industry from the beginning that was at the forefront of the development of modern, innovative advertising techniques.
Art directors and writers are trying to think of concepts to sell the cigarette. And at the time, there were program developers, usually as part of the media department, that would work with the networks in conjunction with the television networks to develop programming that then they would take to the sponsor, the tobacco companies, and propose that the tobacco companies sponsored.
Camels were introduced in 1913. They took out full-page ads, the same full-page ad in newspapers all across America on the same day, the same ad. This had never been done. It was the first ever national advertising campaign, and all the ad said in the full-page ad was, "Camels are coming." And the next day, the ads all across the nation said, "Tomorrow in your city, there'll be more camels than in all Arabia." And nobody knew what camels were. And the next day it said, "Today, you can purchase Camel cigarettes at your local tobacconist. Camel cigarettes are here." They quickly captured 50% of the tobacco market in America.
Color lithography was important because it gave these cigarettes a beautiful artistic nature. There was an oriental cast to it. If you smoked cigarettes, you were sort of like traveling to the Orient. And these were four-color, beautiful, pictures with pyramids. And that's where you get things like Camel with the Eastern motif and the pyramids, or Murad or Sultan or Omar or Abdullah cigarettes. So there was an interesting pattern that whereas in the East they tried to say cigarettes were Western, in the West they tried to say they were Eastern, all of those being really trying to get the exoticism.
The advertising industry used not only psychology and not only sloganism, they used visual imagery in very compelling ways. And this began really at the turn of the century with modern color printing. Murad and Oasis and many of these early Turkish-style brands before World War I have beautiful color pictures that you can find in magazines, hundreds of different variants showing compelling scenes in just gorgeous color that persists to this day. And most magazine colors in subsequent years fade. These are just brilliant. When you look at the design of the times, in the 70s, you see oranges and avocado colors. It looks like Marimekko. It looks like the 1970s. When you go back to the 30s, the style was often referential to contemporary themes. Sometimes it was referential to colonial American themes, or to judicial themes, or political themes, or other constant truths in American life, if you would. Tobacco began with Turkish blends, very rough, like European cigarettes today. They were very rough, and if you tried to inhale them, you'd gag. Even experienced smokers would have difficulty doing that.
Turkish cigarettes, it's actually a type of tobacco. It's a very small leaf. It's called Oriental tobacco also. And it really is just a different type of leaf. And it was valued because it's sort of similar to what's called flue-cured or Virginia tobacco in the United States. It has a very low harshness. It's very mild, and so you were able to inhale it much more. And so that was blended in already beginning in the 19th century. And it's also important because in the Crimean War, you had the Russians on one side against the English and the French and the Turks. And so as a result, the Turks who'd been smoking these small, fine cigarettes, those were passed over into the English and French culture, and that's one of the ways that these Eastern cigarettes get passed over into Western Europe.
For years, the Lucky Strike brand resisted changing their colors. They wanted to because they felt they were pretty ugly, but they had so many millions of dollars in advertising that they didn't feel they could do that. However, the opportunity presented itself in World War II. They made up the story that the green color in the Lucky Strike packs was a critical war material. Of copper went into the green color. Well, in fact, there was nothing of the sort. But you then have an advertising saying, Lucky Strikes go to war.
The industry very early on starts collaborating with Hollywood, getting contracts with movie stars to get them to appear in tobacco ads, and there actually are joint announcements of a new movie and a new cigarette, and these are sort of timed to go with each other.
And it wasn't product placement like we came to learn it later, it was cross-promotion.
Tobacco ads many times, hundreds if not thousands, had movie stars on the front. And a week or two before the movie came out, the advertisement with the star, all of the major stars, John Wayne, Joan Crawford, many of them would show up in the magazines holding a cigarette.
What would happen is that the movie stars would plug the cigarettes, and then the tobacco companies in their advertising would plug the movies. The value of the plugs of the films in tobacco ads was probably more money than the studios were themselves spending on direct advertising. The tobacco companies were working hand in glove with the emerging motion picture industry from the beginnings in the late 20s.
In any given year, a particular studio would affiliate with a tobacco company, and so that as that star's movie came out, they would appear as an endorser. saying, I smoke only Chesterfields, or I smoke only Old Gold, or I smoke only Lucky, because that was the affiliation with the movie theater. So you'll find, for example, Jack Webb, 5 different brands. Ronald Reagan appeared as a young man, in middle age, appeared in cigar campaign, which is wonderful because in the cigar campaign, if you look at the little side, it says, now appearing in Bedtime for Bonzo, is when he pushed the cigars. And you know, he was not alone. I don't mean to pick on Ronald Reagan because virtually every star appeared, to the point where you can almost count on one hand those stars in the 30s and 40s, the classical era of cinema, who didn't.
The first baseball cards were invented by the tobacco industry as package stiffeners.
These were crumbly cigarettes, and they were kind of soft, and so they put these cardboard inserts in, and as a result, they were able to stiffen up the pack and keep it safe. They realized that they could put all kinds of images on. They could put images of baseball stars, naked ladies, politicians, you know, great generals of the world. Later in Nazi Germany, it was, you know, Adolf Hitler pictures. All kinds of imagery were put on these, and people collected them, and the idea was that you should collect a whole series. And this was simply a way to get people to buy a certain brand of cigarettes and to stick to it.
Keep them coming back to your brand. That's the game.
It promoted athleticism as well. If they could do baseball, they could do other sports.
Baseball players, football players, boxers were endorsers because if they're athletic. There were even slogans built around athleticism. For example, they'll never get your wind, smoke as much as you want. Marathon runners, sprinters, they don't get your wind, you know, and people bought it.
Or the ad agency for U.S. tobacco said, wait a minute, you know, how are we going to popularize chewing tobacco? They started paying baseball players a lot of money to have that round can of chew in their back pocket, and as they swaggered across the field, the kids saw that round can, that round image in the back pocket, and they all started dipping.
After the tobacco companies were off broadcast television and radio, they did 2 things. One was they shifted into promotions, sponsoring advertising in baseball stadia, sponsoring car races, things like that.
Sports was using tobacco as much as tobacco was using sports. The sporting companies would get paid a lot. The tobacco industry was sponsoring whole baseball teams. Some of them were actually called just by the brand name, by the mottos of the companies, like the Chesterfield Satisfiers. They got the whole team of the Yankees to on the baseball tour, cigarette selling tour for them. So they were able to use all these techniques in different ways.
Doctors in the early part of the 20th century were highly prestigious. Even though doctors could not do a fraction of what they can do today with drugs and surgery, they were taken as a great act of honor and faith. People trusted their physician, very much more so than they do today. And when the tobacco industry became worried that the public perception was that tobacco was unhealthful, what better way to reassure them than to put the image of a smiling and benign doctor on a cigarette ad, or even on the package of cigarettes.
Some of the tobacco ads implied that smoking was safe or even healthy. More doctors recommend Camel cigarettes than any other brand, said one.
Those advertisements, More Doctors Smoke Camels, appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association and in medical journals all over America. And in fact, the cigarette companies would sponsor hospitality booths at the medical conventions.
Later, we saw low tar and light come into play, implying that the low tar and light brands were safer.
The real kind of modern public awareness of the tobacco issue came in the early 50s with an article in the Reader's Digest called Cancer by the Carton. At that time, Reader's Digest was the leading, most widely read magazine in the world, and they had a major article about this early epidemiological and mouse skin painting research saying smoking caused cancer. There was a broad wave of public concern about this. There were calls at the local level to ban cigarettes, cigarette advertising, to severely restrict the sale of cigarettes, warning labels, all kinds of stuff.
The industry responds by trying to say, okay, there's no proof, it's hazardous, but just in case, we'll provide you with these filters and these low tar cigarettes.
And the way the industry responded politically was in two ways. One was they formed what came to be called the Tobacco Institute to handle its political dealings in Washington, and they created something that came to be called the Council for Tobacco Research, where they said, when they ran a big advertising campaign about it, where they ran an ad called the Frank Statement ad that was published in every major newspaper and magazine in the country, where the industry said that the health of our customers is our paramount concern, and we're creating this independent research body to get to the bottom of the smoking and health controversy.
So they moved into more subtle, indirect forms of advertising where they would say, we've got a lot of filters, or our cigarette filters best. They would never say what it filters out. They would just say it filters best, or they would say it takes the you-know-what out of smoking, and you're left to say, well, what do I know?
Now, filters actually began in the mid-1930s, and for somewhat of a reason that was different than you might think. They were kind of like portable cigarette holders, which became very popular. Famously, FDR always had a long cigarette holder that he very proudly spouted. You can see him on the front of many magazines in that kind of a pose. The normal non-filtered cigarette, when a woman smoked it, frequently little crumbles of the tobacco fell in the mouth, and people were constantly going, and their advertisements showing, literally, you'll no longer have the PFFT if you smoke this filter brand.
But this was a big battle to capture what they called the reassurance market, or the health smoker market. People were afraid of dying from cigarettes. The industry was offering these low tars in this tar war to reassure the public that smoking was safe.
The cigarette companies, because of the initial concern over the tar level and giving this implied message that if we're delivering less tar, we're somehow safer, and people were getting worried about it. And so they got into really heavily advertising. We have the lowest tar, we have the lowest levels, and the implied message being we're the safest.
A very famous filter, which began in the 50s, was the much-touted Kent Micronite filter. And they would say that only smart people smoke this. More scientists and educators smoke Kent than any other brand. And they had all these different professions. Well, I don't know how smart they were, because the Kent filter was made of asbestos.
The industry started identifying what they called target segments. So they would target females in a certain way, and they would design cigarettes for females that would have a red that they could cover up their lipstick with, or they would be long and slim to sort of make it seem like you could stay thin with a cigarette.
The history of women smoking is very interesting. Prior to World War I, the only women who smoked were prostitutes. It was almost the signature of the prostitution trade to see a woman standing outside with a cigarette in her hand. Women began covertly smoking at home, in the early part of the century, when cigarettes became more and more popular because of advances in manufacturing, and men began to smoke more and more, both at home, in the workplace, and out and around. But it was considered absolutely unacceptable for women to smoke outside. If a reputable, polite woman just did not smoke in public. And the industry understood it had a problem, because 50% of their potential consumer base were not available to them. So they were not dumb. They realized it was very important to entice women to smoke. But they didn't advertise directly at women. World War I came around, and during the wars, which were a great accelerant of tobacco use, because women took on man's roles. And when they took on man's roles, they began to feel comfortable exercising what were then considered to be man's habits. So smoking became more prominent in World War I, but still impolite to do in public. Now, this is a fascinating story. Beginning in the mid-1920s, advertising which had never ever targeted women. You did not see a woman holding a cigarette almost ever in tobacco advertising. The very beginning was 1926 with the Chesterfield brand, and it was an advertising that said, "Blow some my way." And it showed a woman next to a smoking man saying, "Blow it over here, give me some of that." And it was the woman was longing to smoke as the man smoked.
In the 20s, they began using women, beautiful women. It was to target a new market where their smoking levels weren't as high.
If you go back into the early part of the 20th century, it was considered rude to smoke in a restaurant. You know, you just didn't do it. And one of Bernays' ideas, again to appeal to women, was to present the cigarette as an alternative to a sweet at the end of a meal. And so he went to leading restaurants in New York and in Paris and other places, and whereas at the end of a meal they used to bring out a dessert tray, they would bring out a tray of cigarettes. So this whole idea that smoking is associated with dining was the result of a public relations campaign run for American tobacco by Edward Bernays.
Now, that was in 1927. It was right at the very beginning of targeting women. And you know what put an end to the campaign, Reach for Lucky instead of a sweet? The candy industry.
They were competing with chewing gum and hard candy, you know, and mints and stuff like that.
Well, the candy industry was furious about this. And in fact, senators from sugar beet states, Reed Smoot famously, got up in Congress and decried the tobacco industry for saying that it was better than sweets. And so they had to stop that advertising campaign because they were going to ban cigarettes from the Schraft stores and from the candy stores, which would have hurt their marketing. Oh, you can only go so far to change culture in advertising. So a brilliant man, Bernays, who was the father of public relations, worked together with the head of the Lucky Strike brand, American Tobacco, and decided that they had to change American culture. They had to make it culturally acceptable for women to smoke outdoors.
Edward Bernays came up with the idea of getting women to march in the Easter Day parade in New York in green, because that was the color of Lucky Strike at the time.
They got a bunch of suffragettes who were protesting for women's rights and the vote and independence. And they had them carry their torches of freedom down Fifth Avenue in New York. Now, this was carried, and I can tell you, I've seen the articles, all over the United States. Now, of course, Bernays and his group helped to push that forward and helped to popularize that across, through publicity, through newspapers across the United States. Within a year, it became acceptable for women to smoke out of doors, not through advertising, but through changing culture. The first woman's cigarette, you'll never believe this because people are very surprised to hear this, was the Marlboro brand. Marlboro brand was, in fact, an elegant woman's cigarette, launched, I believe, in 1927. And its slogans were, "Ivory tips to protect the lips." And you always had these very elegant women in repose holding the cigarette very fashionably. Even today, they continue to target women, especially young women, with pink cigarettes, Camel No. 9s, Dress to the Nine, Cloud 9. You know, and it's designed to get young girls to find smoking to be attractive. We all know about the Marlboro Man. Now, in 1954, at that point, the rather lackluster Marlboro brand as a woman's cigarette turned in one day in a Chicago advertising executive's office, underwent a sex change, and become the Marlboro Man we know today. The hirsute, masculine cowboy. Same rolled up piece of paper surrounding tobacco. Elasticity of meaning, feminine beauty or masculine virulence. This is elasticity of meaning. And you see this over and over in tobacco advertising. It is brilliant. The same product means different things to different people.
They had the tough guys cigarettes for the guys with tattoos and the sailors. They had the intellectual cigarettes, which were cigarettes that would appeal to scientists. The whole history of different groups being targeted is very interesting because you have the imagery of the American Indian, your tobacco Indian sort of cigar store. You had early advertisements that say our cigarettes are clean, they're not made by dirty Japs or Chinamen. African Americans start being targeted in the 1950s, and there's actually a struggle over this in the different companies, because Philip Morris, which was called the nigger cigarette, because they were selling to African Americans and they were supporting the Negro League, and they ended up actually being boycotted by the Ku Klux Klan. Basically, these companies were able to pull any kind of emotional string that you could think of. Whenever they saw an opening, they would sort of charge in If it was women or it was African American, the gay market and lesbian market, they were highly opportunistic.
One study said that advertising plays an even greater role than peer pressure in getting children to smoke.
And so they used a lot of different techniques to get young people to smoke, appealing to sexuality in certain ways, or the young life, or riding motorcycles and so forth.
The vast majority of young people are average and are ordinary, and they aren't Jimmy Dean. But they want to be Jimmy Dean. They want to think of themselves as having a little streak like Jimmy Dean. So that most of the advertisement shows people that are a little edgy and a little dangerous. They might have a tattoo. They might have their hair slicked back and be on a motorcycle. That may not be their life, or it might, but they certainly like to think that a little bit of them has this sort of adventuresomeness, contrarianness, nonconformity.
The industry doesn't really start targeting youth in a big way until after World War II. And the really dramatic push is even not until the 1970s and 80s. Reynolds starts doing this in order to compete with Marlboro, and that's when they introduced Joe Camel and the push to get what they call young starters or rookies or new smokers or beginners. They have about 10 different names for the new starters. And they use this measure of a glacier because they say that the cigarette market is like a glacier that's melting off at one end and needs to have new ice that's always put in the front end. And that new ice is what they call the replacement smokers.
Get them young when they first start, because every time they smoke a cigarette, that taste and that jolt is reinforced, so people become less and less likely to quit or switch brands the more and more they smoke.
I remember the Flintstones on TV and Barney hawking Winston cigarettes, my family brand, on television. I thought it was cool when I was a kid, but I didn't know how dangerous smoking was as a child.
R.J. Reynolds realized that Philip Morris and Marlboro were really taking over the market. And one of the main reasons they were taking over the market was because Marlboro was the leading children's cigarette. And there's tremendous brand loyalty when you talk about tobacco. And since kids were shifting to starting their smoking with Marlboros, then they were staying with Marlboros. And so what Reynolds did was they came up with the Joe Camel cartoon character.
The three most heavily advertised brands, Camels, Marlboro, and Newport, are the same three brands that children smoke the most. So there's a clear association between the amount of money spent on advertising and the amount of smoking. The kids are choosing the most heavily advertised brands.
And so what you ended up with was a situation where Philip Morris and Reynolds were trying to leapfrog each other to see who could get the kids first. And it got younger and younger and younger and younger. And you ended up with research showing that very young children, preschoolers, were more likely to recognize Joe Camel than Mickey Mouse.
When R.J. Reynolds' executive wrote in 1975, we have to youthen the Camel brand. We have to go after the youth, for they represent tomorrow's cigarette business.
The advertising in recent years has moved from magazines and newspapers and from overt presence in TV ads, which went away in the early 70s. They've moved to point-of-sale advertising. So when you go in to buy your Fudgicle after school, the chances are you're going to see a complete wall of tobacco products. And the packs are arranged in beautiful artistic ways. They really draw you in. You can get pina colada flavored cigarettes, and honey flavored cigarettes, and cocoa flavored cigarettes. And there is no purpose of these cigarettes except roping in young kids with sweet tooth to be able to begin smoking, get hooked on nicotine, and become consumers over the long term. The presence of tobacco in a young person's life The presence of it there, everywhere you see, means that it's an ordinary part of life.
The tobacco industry, even today in the United States, spends about $13 billion on advertising and promotion, which is more than ever before. You don't see it a lot because there's not as much magazine advertising. It's mostly done through direct mail, and the tobacco industry realized it can spend $200, $300, or $400 per person advertising.
Even though it's expensive, but they're moving to direct mail because they can highly target the messages that they send to people, and because it's out of the public eye. They can do their marketing in ways where it's very, very hard for the public, for policymakers, for public health people to see what's going on. And they, like one of my students here, got on their list, you know, and he gets a birthday card from them, and he gets a CD of his favorite music. And he gets, like Marlboro sent him a little debit card with $20 on it that he could go spend anything he wanted on. And they sent him a little thing with a number on it and cards he could give his friends. And if they went onto this fun website and typed in this number, this guy got money for every one of his friends he recruited. And if they filled out a fun questionnaire about what music they like, where they hung out, kind of what they were interested in, then both of them would get some money. The bar is a key social institution for young adults, and the industry really, really, really wants to be there. And they've developed all kinds of promotions around that and products around it. And but what's one of the most important things they're doing in the bars? They're going in there under the guise of verifying your age and asking to see your driver's license. They put it on a machine, wireless, scan it, and you're in their database.
The ultimate integration of the product is for it to become human itself. There was an Old Gold advertisement in the 1940s where a woman stood inside an Old Gold box and danced around in an early TV commercial. Again, she became the cigarette. So think of the psychology of this. Beautiful woman's legs in a box of cigarettes. I think they were targeting men. It's like, here's your box of candy to open. This is what's inside. It's kind of Freudian in that way. But also to the industry, if you become a cigarette and cigarettes become you, we own you. We own you thoroughly and completely. When cigarettes are shown as people, they become like ourselves, integral to ourselves. This is the psychology, I think, of a cigarette being a human being. They're an essential component of our life, so much so they are us. The ego boundaries between the person and the cigarette merge and collapse. There's no longer any differentiation, any doubt. It's an essential component of the individual. What happened in the tobacco industry is that they ended up creating the need throughout life. Cigarettes become essential when you wake up in the morning, when you socialize, when you're at work. They're essential to love and romance. They become an indispensable part of modern culture, such that if you didn't smoke, there was something wrong with you. They had the very best copywriters, the very best artists that money could buy, and they used that creative talent to amazing effect to create the need in the American public to smoke as an ordinary part of life, from the moment they woke up to when they went to sleep at night. And it became an ordinary and pervasive part of American life and culture. Many of the advertisements basically said to men, if you do this, you'll get lucky with women. And said to women, if you do this, you'll attract and keep a man.
These ads are not based on fact. They're based on emotion and psychology. And the whole idea of being accepted, cowboys gathered around a campfire. If you smoke, you can be in the campfire circle.
Almost any human need you can imagine, eating, breathing, enjoying athletics, playing games, love, was represented in tobacco advertising in a way that made tobacco products enhance it and make more real. Love was genuine when you both smoked and shared smoke rings together. There's a wonderful advertisement where the husband and wife, the betrothed, are blowing smoke rings, and they form into actual wedding rings in midair. And in other ads, they're encircled by wreaths of smoke, binding them together in their love. This is genuine genius. And the variations on the theme and the creativity in the artistic imagery and in the messaging was unlike really any other product. When you're selling cars, you can do it many creative ways. But tobacco products had no fundamental use. Therefore, they became necessary for all things and a part of all life experiences. Over the years, there have been an amazing number of slogans put forward by the tobacco industry to market their products. Not a cough in a carload.
Walk a mile for a camel.
They'll never get your wind.
Gentle on the T-zone.
Ivory tips to protect the lips.
More doctors smoke Camel.
Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet. Another device that they use is the name of the cigarette itself is very earnest. So you have True cigarettes, Vantage cigarettes, Fact, as though it associated with facts. What are those facts? Well, it must somehow be better and more earnest and therefore trustworthy.
The tobacco industry has employed advertising tactics involving TV and radio and print and now social media really for generations. And what we have demonstrated in California is that those very same tactics can be used and turned against the industry, if you will, to counter tobacco industry messages that smoking is glamorous and attractive, and in turn to inform the public in California about the truth.
So what did the tobacco companies learn? They learned that anti-smoking advertising was more powerful than pro-smoking advertising.
You fight fire with fire. And the anti-smoking movement has had huge success by hiring top ad agencies, just like the tobacco companies did. And those messages have been so powerful.
We feel we've come a long way in terms of very creatively and effectively using media, using advertising to support community-based advocacy, to get important messages out about tobacco and how addictive it is, how deadly it is, and how there are resources to help people to quit and reasons why people should never start. One of our most powerful advertisements, for example, is what we refer to as Voice Box. It's the story of a woman named Debbie who was so addictive to nicotine, she smoked through her Voice Box. It's an ad that made our own staff members who smoked very uncomfortable. And that reaction is what prompted me to say, this is an ad we need to produce. We have been edgy, we have been provocative.
Gentlemen, the tobacco industry has a very serious multi-billion-dollar problem. We need more cigarette smokers, pure and simple. Every day, 2,000 Americans stop smoking, and another 1,100 also quit. Actually, technically, they die. That means that this business needs 3,000 fresh new volunteers every day. So forget about all that heart disease, cancer, emphysema, stroke stuff. We're not in this business for our health.
We have put forward messages that had people talking and changed the way people think about tobacco.
Please consider yourself to be under oath.
Yes or no? Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive. Cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive. And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
Now the tobacco industry is trying to tell us that secondhand smoke isn't dangerous.
Not addictive. Not addictive. Not addictive.
The 50s and 60s may have been the golden age for the tobacco industry in terms of their advertising tactics and techniques, but I would submit today is the golden age for Californians in terms of their ability to live in what is effectively a smoke-free society and to be able to breathe clean air where they work, where they go to school, generally where they play, and do what they do. So I think we're living in the golden age now, and it's the product of 20 years of hard work combating pro-tobacco influences. There was some survey done of the most iconic figures of the 20th century, and the Marlboro Man was the single most iconic figure identified. That says a lot about the power and the reach of tobacco advertising. The California Department of Health concluded, maybe there's an opportunity to turn that around and use that iconic figure to communicate messages that counter the tobacco industry's messaging that smoking is somehow healthy and attractive and appropriate. So we developed a series of print advertisements that use an image of a cowboy to really convey the truth about smoking, which is if you smoke, there's a very good chance you will get sick and you could die. So this notion of Bob, I have emphysema, calling out that the Marlboro Man or that type of figure is not invulnerable to the health consequences of a deadly and addictive product was very powerful. One of the ads that really draws attention to how the tobacco industry tries to manipulate consumers is an ad called Icons. And Icons shows a number of different very glamorous images that the tobacco industry for generations would use to depict how attractive and sexy tobacco use is. But the ad ends with the truth and with facts. It shows a very, very ill man in a wheelchair who closes the ad by saying
that you can end up looking like this.
One of the principal tenets of our media effort has been industry accountability. We think it's critical that Californians be educated about the manipulative marketing efforts of the tobacco industry and how those manipulative marketing efforts are used to draw people into tobacco use. California's anti-tobacco effort reflects that one message does not communicate with all, if you will. Given the diversity of California geographically, ethnically, linguistically, our efforts both in the community as well as through statewide media have been reflective of those cultural and linguistic differences. So we have developed in partnership with media organizations that bring particular expertise and competence to different populations, media campaign efforts that focus specifically on the African American community, the Spanish-speaking community, the Asian American community, grounded in research, grounded in science, grounded in culture and norms in those communities that affect how people think about tobacco and the extent to which they do smoke.
In the 1960s, a very clever ploy was used to fight tobacco ads on television. In the Eisenhower period before that, there had been a recognition that political parties should each have an equal right to access to the news media or to the airwaves, and so they invented what was called the Fairness Doctrine.
There wasn't an official rule, but the de facto rule was for every 3 pro-smoking ads, there was 1 anti-smoking ad.
This was then applied to cigarette advertising in the 60s very effectively because the anti-tobacco people said, well, look, if there's so many minutes of tobacco ads on TV, shouldn't there also be some public health ads as well to balance that in fairness? And so as a result, the tobacco industry voluntarily took their ads off television, and it ended up being good for them.
It's easier to sell the truth than to sell a lie. So you don't need as much anti-smoking. You don't have to match the pro-smoking advertising 1 for 1. You just need to be up there enough that it's in people's consciousness.
California's anti-tobacco effort has been very entrepreneurial and very creative. We have, for example, sponsored what we call Be a Real Hero contest that solicited PSAs, public service announcements, from people all over California. We partnered, for example, with the 6 major movie studios who agreed to place California's anti-tobacco ads on movies that depict smoking that are seen by G, PG, and PG-13 audiences. We are proud of the evidence of our success, and that is there are dramatically fewer smokers in California. We are saving billions of dollars, and most importantly, we're saving lives.
The advertising practices in America have been somewhat constrained by regulation, but nevertheless, there's still huge advertising budgets.
They were able to hire the best talent in terms of movie actors, senators. They were able to pay scientists. And so they're really able to buy a talent in a way that no other industry was able to do.
But make no mistake, the tobacco industry is continuing to invest significant amount of money in advertising and marketing for their products. And while California is fortunate to have resources to get the messages out, it still pales in significance relative to the tobacco industry.
Here is a message about the cigarette controversy from the Tobacco Institute. Guesswork and controversy, as they apply to smoking and health, are no substitute for the facts. Years of research financed by the tobacco industry and other sources have failed to provide clinical or experimental proof that cigarette smoking causes human disease. Statistics may show association, but they do not show cause and effect. What's needed is more research to learn the full facts about smoking and health.